Sam Seder, Emma Vigland on the Majority Report. Joining us now, David Austin Walsh, postdoctoral associate at the Yale Program for Study of Antisemitism, college fellow at the University of Virginia, author of Taking America Back, the Conservative Movement in the Far Right. David, welcome back to the not welcome back, but welcome to the program. And I should say, timing your book pretty good. Donald Trump seemed to sort of give you an assist in many respects with J.D. Vance. We'll get to that. But first, for our audience, give us the broad strokes on William F. Buckley, because I'm of an age where, William F. Buckley was the guy. Having gone to college in the 80s, he was the guy for conservatives at that time. But I don't know that people... he is as prominent in people's minds or younger people's minds. So just give us the broad view of who he was for Republicans and the conservative movement.
Sure. I mean, let me start by saying this. I mean, everybody who is in this line of work, who writes books about the right, the American right, always says that their first book, I was just talking about this with a friend of mine the other day who wrote a book about far right in Texas. Your first book is always about... it's a letter to your parents, right? And so his was about why his parents thought that William F. Buckley was a liberal. Mine is directed at my very liberal parents who used to watch William F. Buckley on TV and thought he's one of the reasonable ones. He's one of the good conservatives. So for the audience here, so William F. Buckley was probably the most prominent conservative pundit and intellectual in the second half of the 20th century, largely because of a show that he had on PBS called Firing Line, which was on from 1966, I think it might have even been 65, basically to the end of the century. And he had on everybody on this show over the years. He started off with interviewing people like George Wallace. He had Ann Coulter on at the end, a lot of arts and media people, and it sort of made his in many respects it was sort of set the template for what sort of conservative right-wing punditry on TV looked like. So that's why everybody knows him. I mean, and he was everywhere in pop culture in the second half of the 20th century. You ever watch Aladdin? One of the many impressions that Robin Williams does, and I think that movie came out in 93, is he does a William F. Buckley impression, because he's very famous. I'm not going to try to do it here, but he's very famous for having a distinctive mid-Atlantic accent. So it sounds like he's kind of English, he's kind of American, he's from New England, he went to Yale, so he's sort of boarding school upper crust that way, and a very distinctive style of speech. But for American conservatives, he was also sort of the leading intellectual figure on the right during this time as well. He was the founder and editor-in-chief for 40 years of the magazine National Review, which is sort of the big institutional magazine of American conservatism in the 20th century. It's still around, although its influence is much less than it used to be. He sort of made his career by writing a book in 1951 when he was all of 25, attacking Yale faculty for being a bunch of communists, called God and Man at Yale, and then followed that up with a book about how Joe McCarthy was right. So sort of a very sort of influential figure in that way. Everybody on the American right and a lot of people elsewhere in American politics were sort of connected with this guy because he was such a social figure and a gadfly throughout much of the 20th century. And he sort of forms the centerpiece of my book, because what I tried to do was, look at Buckley not just through his, the magazines he publishes and the TV show, but the friends of his who turned out to be neo-Nazis.
Yeah, and I should say just two sort of like tangential notes. One, The Millionaire from Gilligan's Island, which is also a dated reference. But also, I'm convinced he was doing Buckley for the most part in terms of an impression.
Oh yeah, Thurston Howell. Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah,
Thurston Howell is definitely lovely, and I should say I would also recommend people Google Gore Vidal and Buckley.
Oh yeah.
Gore Vidal, I had the opportunity to interview a bunch of times back in the Air America days, and it was fascinating. Their exchanges were really
Best of Enemies. There's a great documentary about their relationship in those debates. I mean, anyway, like the Mid-Atlantic accent. Also, was he just copying that from Hollywood? Was that part of it as well?
There was a Brahmin sort of like thing that maybe he was sort of adopting that. There was an aristocracy issue going on here.
I think he came by it honestly because he went to, I forget what boarding school he went to, but he went to boarding schools. He went to Yale. He he grew up in that part of Connecticut. There are still kind of people who speak like that in Connecticut. Yeah. But I do think that he was kind of egging it on a little bit because Buckley, and he always had this kind of status anxiety about this throughout his life. He wasn't a WASP. He embodied like WASP and white Anglo-Saxon Protestantism, but his family was Irish Catholic. They were like new money in kind of the same way the Kennedys were. So he always had kind of that insecurity about him.
Yeah, I think we called them in Massachusetts like cut glass Catholic. I'm not sure if that's a derisive term. It's just what I heard when I was a kid. So, but be that as it may, and we should say like your the Buckley and the thesis here is that, or I should say the sort of like the second order thesis is that the relationship with Buckley is a way in which to illustrate the relationship with the mainstream republicanism with what we consider the fringe. And there's not a lot of daylight. Maybe, like it's like a screen. Yeah. There's a screen there, but the screen lets in some of that light. Let's put it that way. So let's go down. Let's go to Merwin Hart. And take it from there. Who was Merwin Hart?
Yeah, Merwin Hart is a guy who I think I first encountered him when I was doing the initial research for this book, because he was friends with Buckley's dad. Buckley's father was he made all of his money in the oil industry in Mexico and Texas in the early part of the 20th century, and so he was hobnobbing with all of these businessmen when he moved back to Connecticut, all these businessmen in sort of the New York orbit. So Merwin Hart was a guy who was he was the founder of an organization called the National Economic Council, basically a pro-business lobby in New York State in the 1930s. But before then, he was sort of like tangentially involved in politics. He was actually on Franklin Roosevelt's economic advisory, but they knew each other at Harvard. They were both Harvard classmates in the early part of the 1930s, but then decides the New Deal is evil and sort of communistic, and so founds this pressure organization, what was called the New York State Economic Council, becomes the National Economic Council in 1943, and it's a pro-business lobby group. But Merwin Hart, over the course of the 1930s, becomes increasingly radicalized and also increasingly anti-Semitic. He's convinced that the Jews are behind the New Deal. He blames Felix Frankfurter, who's one of the first Jewish Supreme Court justices, for influencing Roosevelt and the direction of the New Deal. Basically holds that communism, socialism, and New Deal liberalism are basically one and the same. And so by the end of the 1930s, he is an unofficial lobbyist for the government of Francisco Franco in Spain. He actually goes to Spain in 1939 or 1938 on basically a goodwill tour. By the way, I'm sorry if you can hear my dog.
No, I was going to say that's for folks at home. That's a dog who apparently reacts poorly to anti-Semites.
Yeah, no, that's good. She's a good dog.
Well trained. I mean, just to stop here, because I want you to tell people who Franco was too, because I'm not sure if people fully get sort of where Franco was on the political spectrum. But how much of because I'm fascinated by Merwin Hart's radicalization, and Frankfurter was also at Harvard. And at least came out of Harvard Law School. And at that time, it's like there was only a certain amount of Jews that were come in, but there was a sense like that's starting to fall apart a little bit in that era. And I wonder, what radicalizes a guy like that? What takes someone? Is it a Jewish guy, he gets divorced and his wife starts dating a Jewish guy, or what is it? Or is it like, they're desecrating my alma mater by letting Jews in, or what is it that radicalizes a guy like that?
Well, it's funny because I think that the kind of like country club anti-Semitism is so the kind of like sense that there are too many Jews at Harvard or Yale or whatever. They're knocking down some of the barriers to certain high status industries. That's where a lot of Buckley's, and he later renounces anti-Semitism, but he grows up in a very anti-Semitic household. That's where that comes from. With Hart, I think it's something different. And maybe in a way more typical of people who become sort of dedicated political, like anti-Semitism is the lens through which I see all of my politics. I think for him, it comes from organized labor. It comes from this sense that, so for your listeners who are unfamiliar with I imagine most of them probably are, with the trope of Judeo-Bolshevism or Judeo-communism. So it's this idea that communism, the Russian Revolution, is the result of a Jewish conspiracy. Communism is just a Jewish conspiracy to, seize control of the world. And there's softer versions of this in American politics in the 20s and 30s, this kind of political anti-Semitism, which is the Jews are the sort of font of radicalism in the United States, and especially in New York State, are identified with the labor movement. And if there's one thing that Merwin Hart hates, because remember, he's a business lobbyist, he hates organized labor. What really kind of turns him against Roosevelt and the New Deal in the early 1930s is he's supportive of the New Deal initially, or at least aspects of it, because the first big piece of legislation, the National Recovery Act, in the early 30s, has a clause in it which sort of mandates the recognition of labor unions. And he doesn't like that. But there's another clause that allows for basically the cartelization of industries, which means that like business leaders can, this is super illegal, at least in theory, right now, but business leaders can collaborate, meet together to set prices and coordinate competition, et cetera, would violate anti-monopoly law, and did later on. But Hart, he's a lobbyist for mid-sized businesses, right? So the idea that you can coordinate with these, and compete with the big corporations, he loves that stuff. But what he doesn't like is the labor stuff. And once the National Recovery Act is struck down by the Supreme Court and Congress passes what is called the Wagner Act, the National Labor Relations Act, so it's the basis of contemporary U.S. labor law, where you have to legally recognize unions and collectively bargain with them in good faith. He hates that. He's totally against that. He thinks it's destructive of business. And that's for him because he identifies labor and labor activists and labor agitators with Jewish immigrants. That for him is sort of the key radicalizing moment. And it's actually very common for people of his specific generation.
Not hard to find like old we may even have one in this office of old photographs of labor rallies where a lot of the signs are in Yiddish.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And we should say, like, the Shirtwaist Factory fire. I think the majority of those women in that fire, they were Jewish and Italian immigrants, and so there is that connection between sort of the labor movement that comes, out of New York City in particular, and Jews. Okay, so because I'm sort of fascinated on like how that happens. He ends up mentoring Buckley. Mm-hmm.
And one of Buckley's many mentors, I should say.
But then he also is a fan of Charles Lindbergh, who tell us Lindbergh and then also Franco, because
there's a lot of ground. Yeah, so Lindbergh's, so I'm assuming most of your listeners know about Lindbergh and know his sort of background. He's from Minnesota. He becomes an international celebrity in 1927 because of his transatlantic flight. And also has a tremendous amount of public sympathy coming his way in the mid 1930s because his son is kidnapped and murdered. But in 1939, he becomes the sort of most prominent spokesperson for the isolationist. Really, historians don't really call it the isolationist movement anymore. The non-interventionist movement against American intervention in World War II. And not everybody involved in the non-interventionist movement was, a Nazi sympathizer. It seems pretty clear that Lindbergh actually was. He wrote an essay right when the war began, basically. It was in November. I think it was in Reader's Digest. Might have been Life magazine. Basically saying that this is, a civil war between the white race and this is bad. So a very sort of committed, what we would call today a white nationalist, white supremacist. So he becomes friends with Hart because they're both agitating against American involvement in World War II. Hart has already cut his teeth a bit on international politics in the late 1930s because, again, he's a fan of Francisco Franco. Now, Franco was the guy who, in 1936, organized a failed coup against a left-wing government in Spain, kicked off the Spanish Civil War, raged for 3 years, killed hundreds of thousands of people. There were foreign interventions by the Soviet Union, by the Nazis, by the Italian fascists in favor of Soviets were against Franco. The Nazis and the fascists were pro-Franco, and yeah, Franco was basically became the fascist dictator of Spain until he died in 1975. And he was very popular in the U.S. at the time, not universally so. But for anti-communist sort of right-wingers, he was the guy who was fighting communism abroad in Spain against this evil sort of Judeo-Bolshevik international conspiracy. And for Hart, he saw it explicitly. He wrote after he got back from Spain, he went over there. He did a grand tour of the areas that Franco controlled. Came back, wrote a bunch of articles for newspapers, and wrote a book in 1939 called "America, Look at Spain," in which he says very explicitly the exact. Bear in mind that Hart in the late 30s is also going around the country, sort of teaching, basically teach-ins for local businesses to defeat labor organizing. He was really active in the Midwest in 1937, trying to break what is now called the sort of Little Steel Strike. The CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, was trying to organize the smaller steel companies at the time. Anyway, so Hart comes back in 1939 and writes this book saying, well, what I am doing in Ohio is just another front in the same global war on international communism that Francisco Franco is fighting in Spain. So he loved the guy, and he wasn't alone. And we'll get into this, I'm sure, a little bit later. But there's, the love for Francisco Franco is something that is very characteristic of the American right down to the present day. So that's who sort of Franco was.
Okay, and so at one point, and this is one of Buckley's mentors. Another, sort of, I guess, was, well, let's talk about the John Birch Society era for Merwin Hart, and how Buckley starts to, what Buckley's theory is, or genuine sensibility, I guess, as to where that sort of split happens. And this becomes sort of like a running dynamic that Buckley has with this ilk.
Yeah, so I'll jump ahead a little bit here. The big sort of foundational myth of modern American conservatism, and I don't mean myth necessarily in the sense that it's untrue, but it is a very simplistic narrative. But myth as in like the story that sort of gives them meaning, is that in 1965 or thereabouts, William F. Buckley Jr., who was one of the most prominent conservatives in the country, decisively broke with the crazies and the kooks and the sort of neo-fascists and kicked them out of the conservative movement, and made conservatism respectable. He became a responsible conservative. And there's a degree of truth to this, but the reality is far, far, far more complicated. And one of the things I try to show in the book is that prior to this point, there was this sort of deeply intertwined and intermeshed relationship between Buckley and other sort of mainstream conservatives and the so-called fringe or kooks or whatever, including the mentorship that Buckley had from people like Hart. Hart's dead by 1965. He dies in 1962. But when he dies, he's the Manhattan chapter president of the John Birch Society, which is this right-wing organization founded by candy manufacturer Robert Welch in Indianapolis, Indiana, in December 1958, and becomes this big sort of national conservative organization. I think they claim 100,000 members at their peak. They're to the point where it's sort of a national crisis in the early 1960s. Maybe for me, and I'm sure this is probably the case with many of your listeners, the first time I ever encountered them, because I was born in '89, they're still around technically, but they're pretty marginal at this point, was Bob Dylan wrote a song which talking John Birch Paranoid Blues in 1963, I think. So they were a sort of staple of popular culture.
I will say, I sadly was had already graduated college by that point that you were born, and during the mid '80s, there was the big controversy that we had was Coors beer was then just a regional beer, and they were trying to come east, and that was the big knock on Adolf Coors, was that he had ties. And the Coors family had deep ties to the John Birch Society, I think it was at that time. That may have been the last vestiges of like it being in the political sort of like centered politically in some ways.
Well, I mean, I think actually what happens, I'm sorry, we're going all over the place, but I just want to, I think what happens in the 90s is that the Birchers sort of lose their cachet as being sort of the authentic spokesperson for the far right or for the, you know, the right wing of the conservative movement. And they're supplanted by people like Rush Limbaugh. So it's less organizational. Then they also have their own internal organizational challenges. Robert Welch dies in 1985. Even prior to this, he'd been retired for a while. They had this sort of revival in the late 1970s, early 1980s. Paul Weyrich, who's this prominent conservative activist, was very closely affiliated with them. He was also big in the Reagan administration. So Reagan had a lot of these ties. But then what happens is in 1983, their president, a guy named Larry McDonald, who's a conservative Democratic congressman from suburban Atlanta, he's on Korean Airlines Flight 007, so the one that the Russians shoot down over the Sea of Japan. So he dies, and yeah, they kind of fall apart a little bit after that. But going back to the sort of the origins in their relationship with Buckley and Hart, you know, really throughout the 1950s, there's all of these efforts to organize a new conservative mass political movement. And part of this is inspired by the political success of Joseph McCarthy, and he brings in all of these people together, and they're collaborating in various ways. It leads to, among other things, the founding of National Review in 1955. But in the 1950s, the most prominent conservative magazine is not National Review. It's actually a magazine called American Mercury, which was founded back in the 20s by H.L. Mencken, the famous Baltimore journalist. But by the 1950s, it was acquired by a guy named Russell Maguire. Maguire was a businessman, also from Connecticut, made all of his money manufacturing Tommy guns for the Army in World War II, and then parlayed that into like oil wealth. It's a typical story with these guys. And Maguire is also close friends with Hart. And in fact, Hart is, I think, I'm not able to sort of say this definitively because but I think, and I try to show in my book, that Maguire gets his politics, and his politics are extremely right-wing, extremely anti-Semitic. He writes about, Jewish conspiracy theories all the time in the magazine. He gets his politics from Hart. And this is a magazine that is more influential on the right in the 1950s than anything that, William F. Buckley or any other sort of, quote unquote, moderate conservative is putting out at the time. So what happens in 1959, 1960 is that Buckley begins to distance himself from the American Mercury, from the John Birch Society, which is sort of linked to these organizations. By sort of famously in 1959, he puts out a memo saying that if you are a contributor to, if you're on the masthead of the American Mercury, you can no longer be on the masthead of National Review, which should tell you something, right? It's like one of those sort of suspiciously specific things that the Bible bans, right? Or like, the church clergy bans in the 1400s. Like that doesn't happen unless there's a lot of overlap between these spaces. And that's exactly the case.
Right. You wouldn't need to put out that edict if it wasn't an existing problem.
Right. One of his best friends, also one of his mentors, because he's a bit older than him, is a guy who's a classics professor at the University of Illinois named Revilo Oliver. They get together in the mid 1950s. Oliver was he worked for the War Department during the Second World War doing like cryptography. He's apparently a very famous or noted scholar of Sanskrit. But by 1955-56, he becomes a conservative activist. he is the book review editor for National Review for the first 5 years or so of its existence. And he and Buckley are apparently close personal friends. They write each other warm, very sort of pompous letters to each other. They're very sort of self-consciously erudite people, so they use a lot of that kind of language. They only have a falling out in around this time in 1959 because Oliver he's a committed anti-Semite. I'm not exactly sure how he comes by that. But he is firmly convinced in this sort of Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy theory, is also writing for the American Mercury. He's one of the founding members of the John Birch Society. He's at that meeting in 1958 in Indianapolis, and he and Buckley remain close until the early 1961, 1962 is roughly when their friendship ends. And to me, that's just, and we can go into Oliver in a little bit later and how he becomes a neo-Nazi, but it is, I think it does illustrate this sort of basic dynamic of, the Birchers, these other sort of quote unquote fringe people, they weren't in the driver's seat of the conservative movement in the late 1950s, early 1960s, but they were there and they were important. Crucially, the sort of narrative that Buckley purges these people, insofar as that actually happens, it only happens after 1965. Why is that date significant? Because it's a year after Barry Goldwater loses in the 1964 elections. And Barry Goldwater was often challenged on the campaign trail about all of his close ties with these radical right-wing groups that were supporting his campaign. He would tell people, I can't disavow the John Birch Society. I can't disavow these extremists or anti-Semites or whatever, because these are the people who are my political base. These are the grassroots that are volunteering for my campaign. And so it's only after the loss that they can begin to sort of put a little distance between themselves and these organizations. But there's still a lot of sort of interplay and overlap between the two. And so that's again, it's a very, this sort of purge narrative is a very, I think, self-serving one for the conservative movement. And that's sort of what I'm trying to challenge in the book.
What was you describe Buckley as basically having a, not quite 1,000, I think, flowers bloom, but or I should say, not a popular front, but a big tent. Mm-hmm. And the problem is that the people who come into that tent, there's a big chunk of them that he has to disavow. Is it a question of has to disavow, or is he offended? I mean, because this is all happening around the time too of the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act. I mean, these things didn't, just drop down out of the sky. We're building towards this. You got, George Romney, very prominent Republican back in 62 or 63. He's marching with civil rights workers. There is there's almost like a riptide. And Buckley seems to be sort of in the middle of that riptide where that convergence is happening. And is he making a strategic decision, or is he making a moral one, or what is he doing there?
Right, and I think it's a strategic decision. I mean, he would probably frame it as a moral one, but I think that's again, that's I think a self-serving narrative. I think the strategic decision is that by 1965, 66, it's very clear that the civil rights movement is not going away. It's very clear that especially after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, you're not going to get to a point like they were in 1957 when Buckley writes this infamous op-ed in National Review in which he says the South must prevail. And he says something to the effect of the white civilization in the South is the superior one. It's justified in doing anything it wants to sort of defend its position, and compares it favorably to the British in Kenya because they're going through an anti-colonial uprising, the Mau Mau uprising at the time.
But he's just talking about cultural things like Southern drinks and dress and. You know,
Well,
juleps.
so so I want to be fair to Buckley here. I think what distinguishes him from, I mentioned Reveal Oliver a moment ago. Oliver is a dedicated biological racist and anti-Semite. So, and what I mean by that is that he takes as his point of departure that races exist as biological and historical entities, that history is essentially a conflict between races, and the white people as the white race needs to take possibly extreme measures to protect itself and its existence. I mean, and again, he becomes a neo-Nazi. You can see very clearly how this goes down that path. Buckley's a little bit different. He is a biological racist. He does believe that there are biological differences between, say, white people and black people. He wrote a letter. I found this sort of exchange in the archives here, actually, at the University of Virginia. One of his contributors to National Review in the 1960s was a guy named James J. Kilpatrick. Kilpatrick was the editor of the Richmond Daily Leader, I think it was what it was called. It was the big newspaper in Virginia. He was also the architect of what was called the Massive Resistance Campaign to Desegregation after Brown v. Board in 1954, the school desegregation Supreme Court decision. And so there's this exchange between the two of them about whether or not, there are biological differences between black and white people, whether or not there are IQ differences between black and white people. And Buckley says something to the effect of, well, yeah, I think that there are, but because I'm a Catholic, we should treat everybody in the context of this sort of universal Christian charity and brotherhood. So he's a biological racist, but he's paternal about it.
Out of Christianity.
Yeah, I mean,
there's an asterisk there that's like, except for the Moors.
There really is, and I mean, and this is characteristic of Buckley going back to his young adulthood. I mean, he is a child of privilege. He is, again, Yale. I remember reading these letters that he wrote. I found them in his archives to his dad when he was in the Army in World War II, and he was in officer cadet school, and he's just seething with resentment about how. And at the time, Buckley was more openly anti-Semitic, seething with resentment about how all of these poor people and immigrants and Jews were being promoted in the army ahead of him, and how nobody liked him because he would tell his squad mates that, yeah, I just think rich people are better. I think that rich people deserve our wealth, and Franklin Roosevelt's a communist. And yeah, that was very popular with his fellow officers, officer cadets. So there is a degree of sort of paternalistic elitism with Buckley, which I think is actually characteristic of of country club conservatism, if you want to call it that, throughout most of the 20th century. But that is somewhat distinct from, or I think that is distinct from the kind of essentialist biological racism that motivates a guy like Oliver and becomes sort of the foundation of what becomes the white supremacist white power movement. It's not a coincidence, though, that many of the leading lights in that movement, Oliver is one, George Lincoln Rockwell, who was the founder and head of the American Nazi Party for most of the 1960s, is another. He was also close at one point in his career to William F. Buckley. He worked for National Review in the late 1950s. They see this guy as sort of a guy that is on their side, even if he can't say it explicitly, even if there are some sort of temperamental differences. But to answer your original question, sorry, I'm getting off tangent here, whether or not it's a moral or a strategic decision. I mean, Buckley is a guy who is willing to, and I think this is true of American conservatism writ large, is willing to kind of go along with the basic claims of the American civil rights movement by using the language of color blindness and racial equality. This is very characteristic of conservatism in the 1970s. Now, this doesn't actually mean sort of substantive agreement or concessions to the claims of the civil rights movement. I mean, they want to and eventually more or less are able to stop school integration, among other things. But it does mean that you can't explicitly say anymore, I'm a white supremacist, I think that white people are better than black people, et cetera, et cetera. Even if you believe that, and many people in National Review world did believe that, and arguably still continue to believe that to the present day, but you're not supposed to say it out loud, and you're supposed to be able to at least make rhetorical concessions to sort of anti-racism, and Buckley was able to make that journey. A lot of the other guys these are the people who form the basis of the sort of modern white power movement, were not able to make that journey. For them, that's even too much of a concession. But even then, I mean, they still want, and this is something I try to show towards the end of the book, they still really want the approval of people like Buckley, and they still fundamentally consider themselves to all be kind of on the same side, fighting against the sort of excesses of liberalism and socialism, and what would now be called wokeness in the 21st century.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, how much of that was ingrained in the right wing ecosystem outside of the people who were, manipulating the conversation or driving the conversation, essentially the base. Like, for me, when I watch Donald Trump today, you can just see that the white supremacists or the furthest right kind of people in the base of the Republican Party have an understanding that some stuff can't be said publicly, and that you can hint, but, he has to say that, but we know he really thinks X, Y, and Z. That training, I think, was laid bare in the Rush Limbaugh days too, but it still pays dividends for the Fox News crowd to this day. Like, how much of that was a conscious choice, and how much did you observe in your writing?
Yeah, and that's a good question. I mean, I think that there is a pattern of that really starts to intensify after the sort of advent of broadcasting, as TV in particular, but also on the radio. I mean, I remember listening to Alex Jones like 10 years ago, and sometimes they would be people who would call in with sort of like crank anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. And he would come just up to the line of saying that they were right, but he wouldn't actually say it outright as a kind of way to maintain plausible deniability. So I think that, well, let me give you an example. And it goes back to the race IQ stuff. So National Review publishes a lot of material. I think I write about this in the second to last chapter. Publishes a lot of material in the 1970s about race science, what would be called race science. So they endorsed the theories of Arthur Jensen, who is, I believe, a Harvard biologist, evolutionary biologist, and he claims that you can trace differences in racial intelligence through IQ tests between black and white people and other various groups. And his work is eventually picked up by Richard Herrnstein, who then very infamously sort of collaborates with Charles Murray to write the bell curve in the 1990s. So National Review is very much, pun intended,
Andrew
ahead of the curve on this. Yeah, exactly.
Sort of like smiles and publishes it.
Yeah. So Buckley's, National Review is publishing this stuff in the early 1970s. And they're also, Buckley has on, I believe it's Jensen himself, it might be Herrnstein, I can't remember, on firing line in 1972, 73 to talk about this. And it's interesting, he has on the next year a guy named William B. Shockley, who is most famous probably as the inventor of the transistor. He was an electrical engineer, I believe, or some sort of scientist out at Stanford, invents the transistor. He becomes very sort of influential and famous because of this. By the early 1970s, Shockley is an explicit eugenicist. He's all about how, I think it's very similar to how Elon Musk is these days, right? He's all about how the right people need to be reproducing, but he's also, explicitly racist as well, right? Like the right people need to be reproducing, and the intelligent people need to be reproducing, and it's white people who we're really talking about, because you can prove that through these tests. Buckley has him on, and while he's very deferential to Jensen in 73, he's just tearing into Shockley in 74, saying, you can't say this, you're being a racist, you're a white supremacist, et cetera, et cetera. Even though what Shockley is saying is not substantively different than what Herrnstein and Jensen were saying, who had the sort of National Review seal of approval. So there's a way in which you can kind of see how I have a chapter which isn't about this episode specifically, but I called it the role of the crackpot. And the role of the crackpot on the American right, I mean, there's really kind of a symbiotic relationship, right? So you have people who are on the far right, who are explicit white supremacists, racists, Nazis, what have you, who are able to kind of push the boundaries of discourse, and then you can have sort of mainstream conservatives come in and say, oh, okay, well that's going too far. But here's somebody who's saying substantively the same thing, but has the patina of respectability, responsibility, intellectual credibility, et cetera. And that's Buckley's role in the mid 1970s to a great degree. Other people play that role at various other times too. But there is kind of a sort of wink, wink, nudge, nudge aspect to it.
Jumping way ahead, and people really should read the book. It's a fascinating sort of intellectual history of these sort of ideas, I guess, and how they get whitewashed. But it feels like Tucker Carlson was the sort of the Buckley of our era, but with two different sort of like specific things. One, where the strategy line was, for Buckley, it was like, you can't say these overtly racist things and you can't be overtly anti-Semitic. It feels like Tucker Carlson felt comfortable getting a little bit closer, to or crossing that threshold. And his line was actually closer to what, we refer to as whack jobs, but closer to those people, like, his producers are on, what was it, VDare or Stormfront. And he was doing those sort of same. There's not as much of a lot of daylight between these people and both the media figures. And I would argue, and you had a piece about J.D. Vance the other day. Let's talk about that. And we could talk about it in the context of J.D. Vance. Tucker Carlson's not as relevant as he might have been, before he left Fox. But let's talk about that. And I also want to talk about like sort of the role of Catholicism in this, because there's a lot of like fundamentalist Catholics who are able to express this stuff in a way that it seems sort of unique, as opposed to like, Buckley wanted to be George Herbert Walker Bush or Prescott Bush in some ways. But much of like this fundamentalism we're getting today, whether it's on the Supreme Court or from like people like Novak, Robert Novak back in the day, these are like Opus Dei people or, fundamentalist Catholics. Talk about that strand too, when we talk about J.D. Vance.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of ground to cover here. Very, very briefly, because I just wanted to address, I think, a key point about Tucker Carlson. I know he's less relevant today because ever since he got booted off of Fox. But one of the things that Buckley's sort of far-right friends or acquaintances would complain about, really into the 1990s, is that, Bill really does agree with us in his heart of hearts, but he can't publicly be on our side because if he were, then he would lose all of his credibility and access with his New York intellectual, Jewish buddies, right? This was at a time where you still had, this is why Roger Ailes created Fox News in the first place, right? This sense that there is a liberal establishment. You need to play ball with them in order to get on TV and still have access, right? Certainly by no later than the mid 2000s, you don't need to do that anymore as a right-wing pundit. You have your own sort of media ecosystem and infrastructure, and that means that you can go much further than you would have otherwise. And Carlson's a case in point of this, because here's a guy who started out on CNN as the sort of token conservative, and then John Stewart Torman. I can swear on this, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, John Stewart Torman, new asshole, in that infamous clip in, 2004. But that didn't really hurt Tucker's career because he was able to go on Fox.
We should say he went to MSNBC before.
Right.
That.
Yeah.
And with Pat Buchanan, incidentally, who was there. There was an era where that was like that was sort of their home. This is pre. MSNBC had basically fired Donahue, and then it was Tucker Carlson, Buchanan, and Scarborough. People forget Rachel Maddow used to refer to Pat Buchanan as Uncle Pat, back in those days, and she got her first contributor gig on Tucker Carlson's show.
And one of the big reasons, and this is not something I write about in my book, but maybe this is a bridge to talk a little bit about J.D. Vance. And I, if I ever write another book, it's probably going to be about the subject. I wrote this thing in Boston Review a few weeks ago about J.D. Vance, in which I basically said that responsible conservatism as a concept is really kind of a creation of mainstream American liberalism. It's creating conservatives who you can sort of be in dialogue with against extremists of both the left and right. Now, it doesn't actually really matter substantively what their politics are. They're just supposed to be sort of interlocutors. That's how a lot of people approached Buckley in the 1960s. Some of the same people.
I just want to add, like, that's what the New York Times does.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
The New York Times claims we need to have conservative voices here, but you're not bringing on conservative voices. You're bringing on people who are sort of like conservative voice translators for liberals to make liberals think that conservatives are not whack jobs. If you wanted to bring on conservative voices, it would not be David Brooks, for instance. It would not be what's his face.
Dutai. I don't even know how to pronounce his name.
Doth Out and the other guy. I can't.
Brett Stevens.
Yes. You would not be bringing on Brett Stevens. You would be bringing on. You would have Rush Limbaugh write a piece, or you would have had, whomever, Tucker Carlson, or for that matter, Steven Crowder or whatever. I mean, that's who you would bring on.
Yeah. And so I mean, MSNBC brought on Tucker, but especially Buchanan in the early aughts, in large part because of his opposition to the Iraq War, right? But he was opposed to the Iraq War. If you read anything he's written, certainly in the 90s and aughts, he's opposed to the Iraq War for very specific reasons that would not be. Sorry, the dog is just howling. The dog also doesn't like Pat Buchanan. But Buchanan opposed the Iraq War for reasons that were highly idiosyncratic. I mean, he was all about how, he read a lot of Sam Huntington. There's this clash, et cetera, et cetera. But he was the sort of token conservative who opposed the Iraq War, and so he was able to get a platform.
I would dispute that that's why he was on there, because that was not. He was on there because they were conservative at that time. I mean, like I say, it was Scarborough country, it was Tucker Carlson, it was Pat Buchanan. Buchanan would bring me on at that time because I was the only Jew he could find who would criticize Israel on television, and it was. I mean, I remember going through this every time. I'm like, I feel gross because I know he's doing this just because he doesn't like Jews. But there's no opportunity to say like what Israel's doing wrong on national television, except for on Pat Buchanan's show.
I think that's right. And I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why the American conservative had a reputation at the time of being, in the early aughts.
So-called paleo conservatives versus neocons.
But the paleocons were, I write about this in the final chapter of the book. I mean, a lot of them were, explicit anti-Semites for a variety of reasons, some of which are more, there was a lot of resentment. Buchanan was pretty explicit about this, a lot of resentment to that. He felt that the neocons sort of pushed him out of the movement that he had helped to build. And so when Reagan came in, there were all of these spoils from being in power that were not, properly distributed because there were sort of these, Jewish intellectuals in the 70s who were liberals but became conservatives, and they took all the spoils. People like Irving Kristol and others. I think that's fair. Although, again, and you would know this better than I, but my perception of MSNBC at the time was that it was, at the minimum, it was the anti-Bush network. That it was the place where you could go and get criticism of Bush and the Iraq War. I'm basing this primarily on just my memories of my parents watching MSNBC.
I can tell you what happened was that there was two phases where Buchanan crossed the bridge, where Scarborough and when in late 04, Keith Olbermann started getting more openly liberal. And so there was this sort of like dissonance in primetime there. And as he started to gain stuff, Phil Griffin was like, we're going with this. And started squeezing out those guys. But in early 04 and 03, those guys still were on there. I think maybe Buchanan never had his own show. Now, he filled in for Tucker and was just a contributor. And he was brought in, Tucker was probably at that point a little bit sort of anti-Bush, but it wasn't a vehemently anti-Bush. I mean, Scarborough, I know I was on Scarborough country at the '04 RNC, and he was not. They were talking about the smoking, gun or the being a nuclear weapon or whatever it was, but
A mushroom
a mushroom cloud or something like that.
Yeah.
At that time, but it was an odd era where there was like sort of two things conflicting, because it was also owned by General Electric at that time. They had 51% of that network, and Robert Wright did not want anti-war stuff on that network.
This actually just confirms, and this is fact. I mean, I'm learning something from this interview, because I don't think historians are really. I mean, we're finally starting to write about the 1990s in a sort of systemic way. I mean, John Gans just wrote that book about the 1992 election.
We just had him on, yeah.
Yeah, Nikki Hammer wrote a great book, in which Buchanan was a big part of it, Partisans, which came out last year, I think, from Basic Books. But we don't really have a whole lot about the 2000s, and this media history in particular, because this is how, especially in the 21st century, how politics is fundamentally transmitted and experienced by people. It's a very, very important story. But so to kind of use that as a jumping point to talk about J.D. Vance and the Catholic thing. And of course, Buchanan's also a Catholic. I mean, there is I think that there is a tendency, and it's not a universal thing in American Catholicism, because, I am not the expert in sort of the ecclesiastical history of the United States or contemporary American Catholicism. I get most of what I know about the Catholic Rite from people like Matt Sitman, the Know Your Enemy guy. Who's a brilliant, brilliant guy. But, there is this kind of increasingly right-wing authoritarian Catholic tradition, which has really sort of emerged onto its own in the past 10 years or so. And I think you can trace it back to people like Buckley, but more importantly to his close friend and I believe brother-in-law, Brent Bozell, who I don't really write about in the book because he's got his own biographies written about him. But Bozell infamously emigrated to Spain for a couple of years in the 1960s because he wanted to live, and this is when Franco is still in control there, and the Catholic Church has a sort of official position in Spanish society, and he loves it. I mean, he comes back, he starts a magazine, he distances himself from Franco eventually, but he starts this magazine called Triumph in the late 1960s. And there is a kind of authoritarian Catholic tradition that you can also see in Buchanan. I mean, he writes in his memoirs about how his father worshipped both Francisco Franco and Joe McCarthy and saw them again as these sort of like interlinked figures fighting international communism. So what happens after the end of the Cold War is, and again, Gans has written about this, other people have written about this, you have Buchanan's culture war speech in front of the Republican National Convention. The enemy, the easily identified enemy, is no longer Soviet communism, but is the internal enemy of this sort of culture war, secular liberalism, etc. I think that one of the things that you hear a lot in conservative circles, this has been the case for at least 20 years, is the sense that they've lost the culture war. There are ways to pressure that pretty significantly. I think it's a gross exaggeration and sort of distortion that allows them to play the victim. But they are right in the sense that gay marriage is now legal in the United States and is overwhelmingly popular. I was just looking at the polls for it the other day. Something like 70% of Americans are in favor of same-sex marriage.
Women are no longer chattel when they marry.
Right, and so this is happening. The mechanics of this are it's typically happening either in courts or state legislatures, which eventually gets the sort of imprimatur of federal approval. And so the only way to stop that then is to and this is what people like Adrian Vermeule, who's the Harvard law professor, has become very influential in these sort of right-wing Catholic circles, is, well, okay, if you want to, this is a war for the soul of America, as I believe Buchanan put it. You have to be able to defend the sort of basic morality of society. That's not going to happen through democratic means because these are actually, generally unpopular ideas to, again, make women chattel, and the right to reproductive health care, et cetera. And so the way that you do this is through sort of seizing the levers of state power and using that to shape the culture. And it's not just J.D. Vance, it's not just Adrian Vermeule, it's also what people like Peter Thiel believe. And Thiel is not a Catholic, I think he's got an evangelical Christian background. But there's a way in which this sort of reactionary right-wing Catholic worldview maps very easily onto the sort of political ideas in Silicon Valley now. And so with Vance, I mean, I was just talking to a friend of mine the other day about this. He seems to have undergone a kind of political transformation. There's a charitable way to read this, which is that he had a genuine change of heart. There's an uncharitable way to read it, which is its political opportunism, which I think is the more accurate way to understand it. But in 2019, 2020, he sort of breaks his ties. I mean, he's feted by the liberal establishment because of hillbilly elegy, because it's supposed to provide an explanation for why rural white people are so pro-Trump. Now, it doesn't actually, if you actually read the book, and a lot of people didn't, it doesn't actually do that. Two, it's basically just blaming poor people for their poverty. All he does is he uses the same racialized tropes about welfare queens and redirects them from the sort of traditional targets of urban minorities to rural whites. Kevin Williamson, who was a National Review contributor, did the same thing for a time in the late 2010s as well. So it's sort of a well-trod territory. But anyway, in 2020, Vance converts to Catholicism, or maybe it was 2021, I can't remember the precise timeline. But he converts to Catholicism, becomes he's always sort of tied into right-wing VC world in Silicon Valley, but then that sort of emerges as the sort of font of his politics. It's interesting. I mean, I think there's a broader phenomenon of conservatives who are not raised Catholic, are not born Catholic, but convert to Catholicism.
Yes.
Because they perceive it to be, and this is just, I mean, I'm saying this now as just sort of informed speculation. I haven't done the work on this, but well, it's not spitballing. I haven't written a book about this, so I'm not claiming it's an internally coherent argument, but I think it describes kind of what's going on. I think there's a perception that Catholicism is in a sense a more authentic and legitimate form of Christianity because, for a couple of reasons. One, it's not based on.
We should let that dog out.
I'm so sorry. I mean, she.
That's right. You can let the dog run around if it's easy.
Oh no! I could try, but she is just going to be completely crazy if I do.
Puppy?
She'll be barking. I'll try it. All
right, let's see if we can.
I'm so sorry.
No worries. No worries.
Come on, Vera. Yes, hello, Vera. Yes, hello, Vera. Okay, wait a minute, because I got to make sure that my gate is closed because my cat lives up the stairs. Yeah, little corgis. Corgis are a handful, but she's very sweet. Anyway, this
conversion to Catholicism. I mean, we have guys like Larry Kudlow, and Novak, I think, was a convert.
So I think that the Catholic Church does not depend on charismatic authority like evangelical Christians do. I mean, there's no Catholic megachurches. It's a much more, I don't want to say rigidly, but there's a defined hierarchy. It's a larger institution. It's bigger than just one charismatic pastor. It's also much more theologically orthodox, let's put it that way, than mainline Protestantism, which has been long decried by these people, and by these people I mean the broader American right, as hopelessly compromised by communists. I mean, really since the 1950s. This was an attack line by Joseph McCarthy at one point. The Protestant mainline churches are all a bunch of liberal commies. So there's that dimension, but there's also a degree of scholasticism in Catholic, in the sort of broader Catholic tradition, right? There's a kind of textual basis to much of Catholicism, which I think does also allow for a greater degree of sort of intellectual seriousness than evangelical Christianity. And because of this sort of legalistic traditions in the Catholic Church, it also allows for more legalistic solutions than evangelical Christian. To put it another way, I mean, in the 1970s and 80s, if you wanted to, she's still there. It is. In the 1970s and 80s, if you wanted to, build political power as a Christian conservative.
It's okay.
I'm sorry. She is just like
she wants to go outside.
No, she doesn't want to go outside. She wants attention, and I'm not giving it to her. But if you're a Christian conservative in the 70s and 80s, you can build political power through the mass movement of evangelical Protestantism, and that can build dividends. You can elect presidents, etc. Whereas with Catholicism. With right-wing Catholicism, again, because of the intellectual traditions, because of the tradition of Francoism and other things, you can think about ways to use state power to shape your sort of preferred outcomes. One of the people who is actually really worth reading about this, even though he's such a weirdo, which is why I love to read his stuff, although he's no longer a Catholic, is Rod Dreck, right? He wrote.
He was the crunchy conservative, like the hippie conservative on his blog back in the day.
Well, he wrote,
I think that was the name of his blog, was like crunchy conservative, I think it was, or something.
He has now since become infamous for, he got divorced, he moved to Hungary, he was from Louisiana, and just has I'm not going to go into all of the sort of details of. I just encourage anybody who's listening, go back and read Rod Dreier's blog. It was at the American Conservative for a long time. It is just the gift that keeps on giving. Apparently, he didn't have an editor either because it was all financed by like right-wing billionaire money. So it was just his pure id. It also very robustly homoerotic too, in ways that are just it made you feel kind of sorry for the guy because he's obviously internalized a lot of bad stuff. But anyway, Dreyer wrote a book in 2017 called The Benedict Option, in which he basically says, well, look, the right, and I believe at the time he was still a Catholic, he's since converted to Orthodox Christianity because that's even more authentic and more theologically orthodox than Catholicism. But he said something to the effect of, the right has lost the culture war. There's no real way to be an authentic Christian in secular society. So we have either to, and so because we can't use state power to shape society to align to these sort of Christian precepts, we have to build our own communities, withdraw from the public sphere, withdraw into our own sort of internal life. And that was Dreyer's solution. He didn't actually practice what he preached. But for people like Vermeulen, for other sort of extremely sort of conservative Catholics, there was an alternative, and it's what has sort of been broadly dubbed as Catholic integralism, which is the idea that you can use, again, state power to shape culture and society in sort of specific ways to conform to, what you believe is necessary for a moral ordering of society. So that's, I think, the sort of broad appeal of Catholicism here. And no doubt some of it is sincere religious belief. I don't want to downplay or dismiss that, but there is a kind of political reasoning to these conversions as well.
Well, all of this is fascinating stuff, and this is like the dovetail between sort of like the Mont Pelerin sort of ideas, which sort of coincide with that, but more in terms of like industry, and the Straussians, who were very prominent, like in the second Bush administration. The Bush W administration. All of these things sort of have, in many ways, brought us to this day where we have like there's a lot of weirdness in Vance.
On that point, actually, I was just talking about this to Paul Rosenberg, who's over at Salon.com. I reread. I read it when it was published. Not when it was published. I read it about 10 years ago, and I revisited it in response to some questions he had about Vance. Peter Thiel's Straussian essay from, I believe, 2007, 2008. So Thiel was heavily influenced by the West Coast Straussians. I mean, he was a Stanford. Was he a JD or was he just a BA student there? I can't remember. I think he is a JD. But anyway, so very heavily influenced by this sort of philosophical school. So people look at, I mean, that was one of the questions that people have about Vance, right? Well, you know, he's Peter Thiel's creation to a certain extent. And yet he spouted, and you know, Thiel was big in the second Bush administration, at least he was influenced by people who were big in the second Bush administration. So why is it then that a guy who was influenced by the Straussians and the neocons is backing the guy who's now like, we need to bring tariffs back, and sounding more like a Buchananite populist? And I mean, one of the things that Thiel wrote in that essay, he had a long sort of digression about how, you know, one of the great insights of Strauss was that when you're writing political philosophy and political theory, you know, you have to prime your audience into sort of reading between the lines. So only people who really know what you actually mean kind of get it, because what you actually mean might be too spicy for the mainstream, that sort of thing. And it's really revealing that he writes this right after a sort of lengthy digression about one of Strauss's sort of intellectual mentors, Carl Schmitt, the sort of infamous sort of Nazi political theorist and jurist who wrote one of the really foundational critiques of modern liberalism from a right-wing perspective. You know, his whole thing is how, you know, among other things, about how politics is all based around the friend-enemy distinction. You reward your friends, you punish your enemies, and that's living authentically politically. And so, you know, I think that I mean, an uncharitable, but I don't think necessarily inaccurate understanding of that essay is, well, it's not, you know, it's basically saying, well, look, like, you know, the fascist critique of liberalism formulated by Schmitt is fundamentally correct. And that, you know, we might be advocating for policies and political ideas that are, you know, broadly unpopular, but what is popular is this other stuff. And so if we can align ourselves with this sort of reactionary populism, then that gives us an opportunity to enact real sort of political power. It's exactly
a spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down. And
I mean, this is exactly what Murray Rothbard, who is the sort of famous anarcho-capitalist, ultra-libertarian guy, concluded in the early 90s. I mean, Rothbard, I remember actually, I talking to John Gans about this at the very early stages of when he was starting his book project, because originally it was supposed to be, as I understand it, a biography of Murray Rothbard, which is I think he made the right decision in writing his book the way he did. But Murray Rothbard, oh God, Vera. Murray Rothbard was an ultra-libertarian kind of weirdo, who was so aghast at the direction of the Cato Foundation, the Cato Institute, when the Koch brothers sort of took it over in the 1980s, that he quit. He's like, I'm not doing this anymore. By the time he died, he was a hardcore Pat Buchanan supporter. And the basic reason, he wrote this in his newsletter, explicitly saying, well, you know, I mean, Buchanan and I don't necessarily agree on everything, but he's really speaking to people and speaking to their resentments in a way that, you know, we can align with this in order to achieve political power, so that we can actually sort of reorder society in the direction that we want. So there is this sense that, you know, aligning yourself with these reactionary populist currents, which are, I think it's fair to call them fascistic in many respects, is good politics, and it's a way to actually implement your sort of political vision. I mean, I don't take the Trump campaign's disavowal of 2025, Project 2025, at face value. I know they're trying to move away from it now that it's been sort of become broadly unpopular. But in the, I think now, fortunately, increasingly unlikely event that Trump is elected, that is going to be substantively the governing philosophy that they implement, because that's where the Republican Party is.
Substantively, I think it's going to be it. Like, they basically have completed their project. They're just ready for, they've aligned all of this sort of ideology. They're still hiring or collecting resumes. They're setting up the pins, as it were, and you can't do much more. Once you've set up the pins, you've set up the pins. You got to wait for, you know, to see if Trump wins. All right. Well, David Austin Walsh, the book is Taking America Back, the Conservative Movement and the Far Right. It's a fascinating read, very important, both in the, hopefully less likely chance that Trump wins. But regardless, this strand of American conservatism, I mean, it's almost the strand. I mean,
even if he loses, that's the thing. Even if he loses, it's not going to go away. And I can't predict what's going to happen in 2025 or beyond, especially if Trump loses with American conservatism. But I mean, the party has been so fundamentally transformed by Trumpism that it's hard to believe that we'll see, at least in the short term, the kind of Clintonite triangulation, except from the right. That I think is the media certainly is primed to expect, but I don't think it's going to happen.
No, I agree. I mean, it's almost as if once the king is deposed, there are 4 dukes that all are primed to take the throne, except for they're all lunatics. And
I also enjoy playing Crusader King, so I appreciate it.
There you go. David Austin Walsh, thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.